I'm pleased to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the University Committee on Lectures. We are delighted to have as our guest Dr. Fernando Belaunde Terry, who is noted for his democratic administration as President of Peru from 1963 to 1968. Dr. Belaunde is an authority in international affairs and planning. Many of you will recall the stimulating and important lecture on Latin American and U.S. relations which he delivered here in December of 1972. Educated in Peru, France, and the United States, Dr. Belaunde's career ranges from practicing architect, regional planner, author, and professor to leader of Popular Action, the political party he founded in 1956. He also founded the Department of Architecture in the National University of Engineering in Lima, Peru, and was its dean for 15 years. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard University, American, Columbia, and Johns Hopkins. He is currently teaching regional and urban planning at the George Washington University. Among the many international distinctions he has received are the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Texas, the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Hamilton College, the City of Lima's Municipal Award for Outstanding Contribution in Public Housing, the Gold Medal at the Rimini, Italy Biennial for his proposal of the Marginal Forest Highway project along the eastern slopes of the Andes. This was a multinational idea involving Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia. He is an honorary fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Tonight, Dr. Belaunde will be speaking to us about new approaches to inter-American relations. The title of his address is A Self-Sufficient Hemisphere. And now, with us, Dr. Belaunde.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to be back at Ames after about 2 or 3 years. The fact that I am recalled once again makes me somewhat optimistic about the possibility of going back to Peru. But the academic world is somewhat different to the political world. And I am also very pleased to continue in contact with American campuses and enjoying greatly my relation with faculty and students here. For the last few years after I came to the States, new events worried the American people and the Latin American people, and most especially the energy crisis. As an answer to this crisis, the President of the United States a few months ago talked about a so-called Project Independence, by which it seemed there was a possibility for the United States to become self-sufficient and face an emergency. Although I recognize that this country has many natural resources and a great capacity for action and for facing adversity, it is a fact that it is not easy to achieve self-sufficiency today in any one country of this hemisphere, even in the most powerful of all the countries. You know very well that you still depend to a large percentage on some essential products from the rest of the world. It worries me, for instance, to know that you lack manganese. You do not have sufficient manganese, and whatever you have is not economical to exploit. You are importing a large percentage, and I believe you will be importing about 85% very soon. You lack tin. Several sophisticated minerals that are found in abundance in South America are needed in the United States. The aluminum industry is depending on bauxite, which comes from abroad. And there are many items in which you can clearly see that project independence is not so feasible. It may be feasible to a certain extent. You may be able to keep a stockpile of some of these elements, but the fact is that the hemisphere's self-sufficiency is much more feasible and, in my opinion, more desirable. We kick somewhat in Latin America of being somewhat dependent on the industrial nations. Perhaps the answer is to make you dependent on the Latin American nations. And if we are both dependent on each other, that may solve the problem of interdependence. Evidently, we have to try to organize our foreign policy on this basis. We have to have a goal. And that goal could be to make this hemisphere self-sufficient, and this hemisphere evidently can be self-sufficient. It has sufficient natural resources. But there is a need for a new diplomatic approach to work together to eliminate some of the unnecessary tensions. On the one hand, to help the Latin American countries exploit and find their own resources and develop certain industries for refining those products. And on the other hand, to obtain a certain security that you will have a sufficient supply, not in faraway continents that are menaced now constantly, but rather right here in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the thesis I want to develop today, although I want to put certain emphasis in the problems of the sea. Now, to achieve this, it is essential to have an inventory of natural resources. Something has been advanced along these lines. You evidently know very well what you have in North America, especially in the United States. But we still ignore the nature and the amount of our natural resources in about 50% of the area of South America. I remember well being in office with government responsibilities. Sometimes projects were delayed because we didn't have enough information about our natural resources. I recall one day having finished a project with very good results, a pre-feasibility study for a highway in a valley in the jungle. We had studied only one bank of the river, and that was sufficient to justify the project, the foreign loan. But when we finished, the bank that was concerned asked us for a similar study on the other bank. Naturally, that required 2 or 3 years of work. And this is a type of thing that delays development in Latin America. The orthodox systems of exploring and studying the continent, even if you use aerial photography, they are still very slow, and we should try to use all modern facilities to speed up the process of completing this inventory of natural resources. Since I came the last time, this country has made a tremendous advance in the space program. I always compare the efforts of the Spanish and Portuguese in the 16th century, 15th and 16th century, in exploring, and I call that the age of horizontal exploration, where everything was done by sea and consequently, there was a very good knowledge of ports and littoral seacoast, but some ignorance of what happened beyond that. While today we live in the age of vertical exploration, and the conquest of space evidently has opened great possibilities, a new horizon for this type of information. Your first venture in space for the detection of natural resources, as you well know, was done through the Earth Resources Program and by Earth-1, the first satellite that you put in space for this purpose. And unfortunately, the second one, Earth-B, was somewhat delayed and will be launched, I believe, in a very short time now. But the results have been very encouraging. I wish I had this type of facility when I had government responsibilities. Unfortunately, they began in '72, several years after I had left. These facilities, which I have been able to evaluate in several parts of the United States and especially in the Washington area, have provided us with information, as you well know, regarding not only geography, but geology, not only mapping, but some interpretation of that mapping, but also very accurate information about forestry, agriculture, and what to me is very important now, about the ocean. Evidently, the remote sensors that are 500 miles up in space can see much more than the human eye through bands of red, green-red, infrared. They can detect, as you well know, a lot of information if you have the proper ground support and if you have capable people all over the world to provide some additional information that will complete the interpretation of this important material. The remote sensors are so accurate in some aspects that they show details that sometimes are overlooked. I remember well, for instance, something that happened to me in government. An Italian firm came to see me to make a present for the government, a bridge, a metal bridge, which was very expensive. And the manager of that company told me, we want to present your country with this bridge. I know you will need it. You have so many areas where you need bridges in your government road plan. And I asked, how come you have a bridge available? Will you explain it to me? He said, well, we went to the jungle, the Peruvian jungle, to make a colonization project, build this bridge, and when it was finished, the river changed course. The river took another course. So we have no use for it right now. That shows you how dynamic the world is, especially in some areas that are young, geologically speaking. And consequently, how important it is to record those changes. And this, to me, is perhaps the great feature of the Space Resources Satellite Program. They record a picture of the same place every 18 days, and now that they are going to have a second satellite, it will be every 9 days. This will not give you mapping that will be outdated. It will give you new mapping every few days, and you will be in a position to detect any changes. Imagine what could be done in the case of earthquakes, for instance, determined, as we had in Peru, by a landslide. The White Range in the Andes was very heavy with snow. That snow fell and broke a lake, and this buried the beautiful town of Yungay. I remember in that catastrophe we lost two very nice American girls from the Peace Corps. Well, that could have been detected if we had at the time this facility, because you can record any changes in the earth by this periodical picture through several bands that will give you all kinds of information. This is a tool in the hands of the United States. I understand Soviet Russia also has a similar program, but the American information is available to anyone. And at the present time, when we are so much concerned with hunger and the necessity to feed continents that are somewhat hopeless because they are not only of great human growth and population explosion, but also of very heavy density. We do not have a high density of population in South America. So we are very much concerned with the sea. And this is why the Latin American countries, very early, since 47, had new decrees about a new approach to jurisdictional waters. In my last talk here a few years ago, I said something about that, but we didn't have what we have today as a possibility of new information from the space. We thought that bordering nations should have the responsibility not only to preserve, but to exploit intelligently the natural resources. And to that end, the governments of Chile, Peru, and Ecuador gave decrees extending the concept of territorial waters from 3 to 200 miles, nautical miles. 5 years later, in 1952, the three countries got together and made a joint declaration, and then later on in 1970 at Montevideo, the new concept of the law of the sea was drawn up. All this came as a consequence of an American attitude in 1945, when the late President Truman had a new interpretations about the sea and extended the fishing limit from 3 to 12 miles and introduced the concept of the continental shelf, in which instead of being concerned with horizontal distance, he was concerned with depth, with vertical distance, considering the continental shelf as far as it could go for any possibility of mining or the use of the resources of the bottom of the sea, of the seafloor. Consequently, a new doctrine was established, and the very old-fashioned and obsolete concept of the 3-mile limit was practically abandoned. But today, the world has not made up its mind yet, and since then there were many international conferences, one in Caracas about a year ago, and then now one in Geneva that is progressing right now, but it seems that it will not reach a world consensus as yet. I wonder if they went from Caracas to Geneva just to give the delegates a chance to look at the ocean. But the fact is that it doesn't seem, a solution doesn't seem to be near, and there are some clouds of possible tensions in the future about the sea. You must remember that in the Earth, in the sphere, 70% of the area is covered by water, and we only get less than 2% of our food from that immense area. The advances in oceanographic studies have proven that you can obtain so many essential elements from the sea, and the experience in fishing, in large-scale fishing, especially in South America in the last few years, has been very important. Now we want to ask, what is the new satellite going to do to promote the knowledge of the ocean and not only the coastal areas, but also the high seas and the sea floor. And I am very optimistic about it. Evidently, one of the areas subject to erosion is the coastline. One of the areas subject to pollution is evidently the coastline. In the case of the Pacific, for instance, the rivers are great torrents creating very deep canyons. They cross the desert, the Peruvian desert and the northern Chilean desert, and come to the sea bringing a lot of minerals that enrich plankton. And this is why we have, together with other environmental conditions, such as the Humboldt Current, for instance, a diversity of fish, and as a result of that, many seabirds, and as a result of that, we have guano, a great fertilizer, or the basis of a fertilizer, and somewhat of a compensation if we consider the aridity of the coast of Peru. The land is very arid, the sea is very fertile. So there is a natural compensation there, and the land contributes with a lot of minerals to enrich plankton, the bioproductivity of plankton. Now, we have to know more about the sea. We do have an Institute of the Sea at Callao, and we are keeping track of many data that we can collect. But we could collect with a new satellite such things as the content of chlorophyll in plankton. We could be informed about temperatures and especially about currents. Very recently, the Humboldt Current went somewhat apart from the coast of Peru, and it took all the anchovies away. And for 3 years, Peru had to face a great economic emergency by which 30,000 workers were out of a job. That meant about 100,000 persons. And then there were sister industries to the fishing industry in which another 100,000 were concerned. So this telluric or environmental phenomena deprived Peru of 1/3, 25% perhaps, of its foreign trade. Naturally, we could not correct that from space, but perhaps we could make a correct forecast and take the necessary measures and plan in advance. Consequently, as you can see very briefly, this is a great weapon that the 20th century has to offer, and it's something in the hands of the United States that has been pledged for the benefit of humanity since the space program was begun back in the time of President Eisenhower, and it was ratified later on during the Kennedy administration. And finally, there is a new concept now of the space program that its benefits are not for the one individual country contributing to the program, but rather for the whole humanity. Naturally, it is essential, since we are very near the intense utilization of the sea to solve pressing world problems, to define a new approach to international law, and finally to reach a conclusion about territorial waters. This is what the Conference of the Sea is supposed to do, and naturally I am concerned that perhaps the old colonial struggle on the past, where the great powers were fighting for land, could have a modern version, a somewhat naval version, by which the great powers eventually would be fighting in the sea for the resources of the sea. And this could come, as you know, if the Soviet Union and the United States have more or less the same position in regard to the 200-mile limit which they reject. Communist China has a different view. They are backing the 200-mile limit. And consequently, I think this is the time to reach a solution and that will make the world, put the world in a condition by which the resources of the sea could be obtained. Now, a new policy has been enunciated by the Secretary of State, a new dialogue. Evidently, a dialogue is just a means, it is not an end in itself. And I think, very respectfully, naturally, that concept should be somewhat enlarged, and it should be a new dialogue with action. It's not just going to South America in a few days for talks, but rather for conversations that will lead to action. And naturally, we have to know where we are going. In my opinion, and this is what I want to propose to you tonight for discussion, we should have a goal of hemispheric self-sufficiency. And with this goal in mind, the United States would be in a position to speed up industrialization in Latin America, the use of natural resources, and we would be in a position to alleviate some of your great tensions here, especially in the energy crisis. If you look at the statistics of energy, Latin America doesn't mean very much right now as far as a percentage of world energy. But as far as potential energy is concerned, especially South America has a lot to offer. We still have an immense hydroelectric possibility. As you know, the Amazon is the largest river in the world. There was a certain discussion whether it was the Amazon or the Nile, but the National Geographic Society recently proved that the Amazon was somewhat longer, and evidently the flow of water in the Amazon is immense. It's 20 times the Mississippi. A great part of that comes from the Andes, this very tall wall with peaks at 22, 23, 24, 25,000 feet. And evidently this change of level permits canyons that have great hydroelectric possibilities. I could count in Peru 4 or 5 canyons that can offer very easily 5 to 10 million kilowatts each. Then, in the coast of Peru, and in the coast of the Pacific, any irrigation project, based on the fact that you have to turn rivers that usually go on to the Atlantic, you have to turn them through tunnels to come to the Pacific. Each irrigation project in Peru offers at least 300, 400,000 kilowatts, and we have from 20 to 30 projects already studied. Consequently, my own country that only has 2 million kilowatts installed right now could have, if we have the money naturally and the market, could install 40 million kilowatts of clean, non-polluting type of energy. There was a Peruvian that used to say that power plants, hydroelectric power plants, he was exaggerating naturally, do not cost anything because they are amortized, they are repaid ad infinitum. They can last perhaps forever. Evidently, this is not exactly true, but they last a long time. Consequently, it is very hard to beat them as far as investment is concerned. Well, we have the possibilities, and if you go to other countries, Bolivia and Peru with Lake Titicaca, that lake at 12,000 feet of altitude, is an immense natural reservoir. Some more water could be diverted to it, some water could be taken from it, and with the drop of 12,000 feet to the sea, not only for irrigation, we could have a great amount of power generated. Now, is it possible to transport energy that far? Usually this is a problem, but nevertheless, great advancements have been made in this field, and recently when I was at Vancouver, I was told that that Canadian city is getting energy from a source 700 miles away. So that is a great advancement about transporting energy. And when I visited Carbondale, where Professor Buckminster Fuller lives, I didn't have the pleasure to meet him because he was in Europe, but I talked to some of his assistants long time ago, and they told me that they thought that perhaps a great hydroelectric ring in the northern hemisphere, that is where consumption is very, very important, in Europe and Asia, Russia, China, Japan, and then Alaska and Canada and the United States, practically a complete ring could be connected with two great power lines, one coming from southern Africa, the other coming from southern South America, all along the Andes, picking up the energy that could be produced there. I raised a question about the difficulties of transporting energy, but they say that that was not such a complicated matter. There is another question that we could use that energy right there in elementary basic processes of industrialization, and that way the industrial world perhaps could save that energy. For instance, in the case of Venezuela, that is a very important country now in developing hydroelectric power in the Caroni River and the Orinoco River, they could process bauxite and save you a great part of that energy, since processing aluminum in the United States spends so much energy, and you do not have the raw materials right here. A few days ago, I was invited to a beautiful American city for a conference, Williamsburg, in Virginia. And we were talking about development of South America. Says the bauxite they have right there. That project naturally could be a complete industrial project, and it would have the American market, and an immense saving would be made in energy. This is not to mention the petroleum question, which you know very well, and in which the Andes are very promising. Not only in Lake Maracaibo, where you have the reality of a very large exporting country, but all along the drilling in the eastern slopes of the Andes. Ecuador was very successful in finding oil. Peru has made some important discoveries. Further south in Bolivia, around Santa Cruz, there are some new petroleum discoveries, and Argentina, along the Andes, out Neuquén, also, and at Mendoza, has had luck in this exploration. And there only seems in South America to be two problems. One, Chile, that still depends for about 80 to 90% of its oil from foreign sources, and Brazil, which is importing 80% from the Middle East. Evidently, Brazil is in the process of exploring, and since it is such a large country with a diversified geography, it is evident that they are going to be successful. The recent findings at Campos, near Rio de Janeiro, are very promising. Consequently, South America is going to be quite well supplied in the future from the oil and gas point of view. The Central American countries are somewhat a problem in that aspect, but nevertheless, Mexico very recently, as you probably read, had found petroleum in the Tehuantepec Isthmus, which is very close to Guatemala, and it seems that they are going to be very promising in a geographic location where they will be near the Pacific and near the Atlantic, and a pipeline across the Tehuantepec Isthmus would be evidently very easy to build. This is what shows a possibility of exchange and the necessity to face a future emergency. We all do not want to think of the possibility of another conflict, of another war. But there still is this possibility and this menace. And the only security that we can find is to make the hemisphere united again. We have to fight the tensions, try to show the cards, give and take, make both North and South interdependent, and show the world that we are as we were in the two other conflicts. In the first war, as you well know, during the government of President Wilson, he was very much concerned to maintain the unity of the hemisphere. And although he had some problems in Mexico, and there were some grave errors, such as the landing of American naval forces in Veracruz, he managed to complete understanding, even with Mexico after those tensions in the days of the Mexican Revolution, and we faced the First War in harmony. In the Second World War, there was also a danger of disunion, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt, with very able assistance from Sumner Welles, succeeded in keeping the hemisphere united, although Argentina and Chile were so reluctant to break relations with the Axis. You know the ties with Italy from Argentina and with Germany, and there was a tendency not to break relations with those countries, but in the long run, the whole hemisphere either broke relations, severe relations with the Axis countries, or declared war, either symbolically or practically, as did Brazil, who was a participant in the hostilities, as you recall, in Northern Africa and Italy. Well, if we have to face another emergency, the conditions look very alarming right now. There are great questions, the problem of Cuba, some unrest in the continent, some revolutionary activities, some terrorist activities in several countries. Stability is questioned. There is a great diversity of types of administrations, even in the military. Some of them are to the left, others are to the right. And the situation of the United States after a long time of neglect is not as it was in the Second World War. I think that policy has to be revised. Evidently, during the 60s, we experienced two assassinations. One, the very unfortunate death of President Kennedy, and two, the death of the Alliance for Progress, which was also assassinated by the so-called leverage, by too much interference from private interest in the development of a program that had to be completely independent of any corporate interest. So we should derive some lessons from this, especially from that failure. and we should begin rebuilding the unity of the hemisphere. I realize naturally that there are many errors in our part. There are many prejudices in the South, but also there was a neglect from the part of the United States. The attention of this country was completely absorbed by the Middle East and by Asia, and we find today the whole hemisphere in danger. It is disunited. It is not ready to face an emergency. If we succeed not only by a new dialogue, but rather by a dialogue and implementation, by a dialogue and action, and we rebuild on the basis of mutual interest the unity of the hemisphere, I think that will be a great security for world peace. The United States may be very vulnerable unless this is achieved. This is what I briefly wanted to tell you, to have the opportunity to answer your questions if I can. But before I do that, I want to tell you how grateful I am to have had this opportunity to return to Ames and to express once again my gratitude for what this university did in the field of agriculture during my administration and what it is doing today in Peru with the assistance of people from my country that were trained in this campus and that are rendering now very brilliant service to my country. Thank you very much.
Very good speech.
May I answer questions?
Yes, I'll make a short announcement. We will have a short question and answer period, following which you're all cordially invited to go to the Cardinal Room, where we will have coffee and more time to talk with Dr. Belaunde. Okay?
Thank you. Any question? Yes? Well, I believe very simply what you can give and what you can receive is as follows. We are in need of knowing our resources better. You have the technical tools to help us in that direction. In fact, you are doing it, but not in the necessary scale. Then we are in need of providing industrial jobs. Our labor force is increasing constantly. Even in a medium-sized country like Peru, the labor force is increasing 120,000 people per year. In terms of money, it means $10,000 per person as far as investment is concerned if we want to give them industrial employment. We are in no position to make such an investment. Our industries have to be connected with our raw materials. We have to add them all the input of energy and labor we can. This could evidently be done with a greater effort through the development institutions. A great financial effort would have to be done through the Inter-American Bank, the Export and Import Bank, and the World Bank. In a much larger scale, we know that whatever scale they have used right now has been insufficient. We should be developing our sources of energy, either to sell the energy to other markets, if that could be achieved in a short period of time, or to use it right there in our own raw materials to be shipped to the industrial world. That way, we could evidently provide many jobs. On the other hand, you have to revise your industrial conditions. You cannot afford to be vulnerable. You cannot afford to have to import even copper. You are the first producer of copper in the free world, but nevertheless, the forecast is for imports in the order of 30% in about 10 years from now. You import all the tin you need. There are many things as chromium and nickel that you have to import. Consequently, you have to cooperate in developing perhaps the Amazon, the eastern slopes of the Andes, and the River Plate development, which is a development as large as the Mississippi Basin. We would achieve the complete self-sufficiency of the hemisphere if this effort was started. This is much more than a program of grants. It has to be based on a new system of credit and a reinforcement of the world institutions. Any other question? Yes?
I think you're right in the probabilities of hydropower increasing very significantly in price and value in the world. But I think one of the problems is that hydropower, that same water is also used for food production. And while there are certain complementarities between food production of water and power production of water, there is a very definite competitive range. And you take in the western coast of South America, particularly your 30 river valleys in Peru, rivers coming down out of Sierra. In Peru, what would happen if that water were converted to hydropower? Presently, the variable cost of water in Peru right now is very, very low. It's close to zero outside of the installation cost, the water cost per se. And think of the tremendous increase in cost. That would mean that agriculture would have to bear to use that water to produce anything in the way of food crops or other crops on the whole western shore of Peru and parts of Chile and parts of Ecuador. So there are repercussions there, you see, of the source of water. You switch the power then, you're going to bear some real costs in terms of food production or fiber production.
Well, I somewhat question that. I think you're making a point that requires some time to discuss, but I do not see why there should be a conflict in this field. For instance, if we use the Pongo de Manseriche, the rapids of Manseriche, and we dam the rapids of Manseriche, that wouldn't harm agriculture at all. On the contrary, it would give the Marañón River a steady course, and we would be in a position to use very fertile land on both sides. We would not be affecting the coast whatsoever, the coast of Peru. We would be working with Atlantic Ocean waters. Now, as far as the coast is concerned, where we have irrigations, I do not see why, for instance, the Aguada Blanca dam in the Joya irrigation is harming agriculture. It is expanding the area of the Joya lands. Do you have any objection to the Tinajones dam for agriculture?
No, but I think the situation on the east side of the Andes is considerably different than it is on the west side. And if you divert water from the east side, from the Atlantic side, to the west side, that's like our big Thompson project, say, in Colorado, where we did a very similar thing.
Yes.
But that, of course, is very, very costly in terms of resources.
Well, really, the Tinajones project in the second step is just that type of a project where you take waters from a river and bring it to the Chotano River. And the Majes project, well, the Marca Pomacocha project is that type of a project. It may have perhaps some influence in the Mantaro Valley, some negative influence. I wonder if you have experienced that. But the main source of power, in my opinion, is in the rapids towards the Amazon, where we already have too much water, and where the courses of the rivers are not steady. If you dam the Pongo de Manseriche, the Pongo de Aguirre, the Pongo de Coñac, the Pongo de Mainique, each one means 5 million kilowatts. And they wouldn't take any drop of water from the Sierra. They just would raise the level there to produce a fall. I wonder if I'm explaining myself. It's a rather technical matter. But I am just placing a picture derived from the fact that the northern hemisphere is using all its water, and the southern hemisphere still has a lot to offer as far as hydroelectric power is concerned. And I will tell you an anecdote about this that explains my point. When I went to inaugurate the Marca Pomacocha project, which is a dam for electricity, waters from the Atlantic that are transferred to the Pacific from east to west to produce electricity, I sat next to the late Mr. Boveri, who was a very important technician from the Brown Boveri firm in Switzerland. They had provided the equipment. And I asked his advice. I said, I have to sign a decree to begin the Mantaro project, which is a large hydroelectric project, as you know, which is now completed in the first stage. And I'm very worried because it's a very hard decision for a country like Peru. It involves several $100 million, and I don't know what to do. I am really confused. And then he told me, by 6 years from now, when the project will be finished, every plant will be a nuclear plant. Now, 6 years have passed, the job is finished, and the nuclear plants are still more expensive in Peru. We don't have a single one. They do in Spain, where they have used the last drop of water. They are building several nuclear plants in Spain. But in Latin America, the Andes have the great advantage. They have so many disadvantages. They create so many challenges, but they have one compensation. They have minerals and power, hydroelectric power possibilities, gas and oil. So we have to work around those realities. And I think American know-how, American capacity to finance is very important. Yes?
You mentioned at the very end of your talk that you felt that the self-sufficiency of the hemisphere required a new kind of credit. I am wondering what changes you contemplate in the way the credit system currently works in the hemisphere, and if you feel that somehow this can change the present situation of having some nation states which are eternally dominant and others which seem to be eternally subordinate.
I'm talking about the necessity of transferring savings from areas where savings are abundant to areas where savings are needed. Naturally, this is where we play an important role. We have to be more stable. We have to give a complete guarantee, and you have to be able to channel more savings through the usual channels of the great development banks. I am not in favor of creating new bureaucracies, but for instance, I would be in favor of increasing resources for the World Bank or the Inter-American Bank, and that can be easily done by the United States. They could very easily attract more funds in that direction. And naturally, with a serious and concrete offer for development, which could not be improved by anyone else because you are a powerful country, I am sure the governments of Latin America would be willing to revise their own attitude and get together in this idea of a self-sufficient hemisphere. Any other question? if there is no other question, I want to tell you that I am very sorry that this visit of mine is so brief. Tomorrow I have a class at GW at 1 p.m. I'm sure I will be able to make it, but I had such good memories from my previous visit that I was expecting to remain somewhat longer here. Anyway, I'm sure whether things remain as they are, in which I will be in the United States, or even if they change, I will be coming back to Iowa to express once again my gratitude to a great university that has done a great task of development in my own country. Thank you.